Welcome, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for coming, especially the folks from across campus. Diane, thanks for coming, Laura. Appreciate it.
So,
Today it's my pleasure to introduce a grassland ecologist who I have utmost respect for, who does really amazing stuff. Is grassland ecologist the right word? Landscape ecologist, fire ecologist, rangeland ecologist, all those are accurate.
a million of ecologists.
Dirac Twidwell is associate professor at the University of Nebraska in the Department of Agronomy and Horticulture. He's also the science advisor for Grassland Conservation Science Network, sponsored and organized by NRCS. He's been doing a lot of great stuff at landscape scales, looking at the interaction of fire and other types of disturbances in the Great Plains, all across the Great Plains. I will step away now and just ask you guys, please join me in thanking Dirac for his time.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. It's just real pleasure to be here. For me, it's a real comfort zone too. I always like really diverse groups like this. So a lot of the rangeland profession and so forth, it's very little where we still have like a room like this where we have, say, the animal science side, the ecology. I'm seeing multiple badges on people's shirts and so forth. So let alone then, the traditional kind of plant side of rangelands too. So this is great. And I think it's what's critically needed if we're going to meet a lot of the pressures we have this century. In addition, Lance was really, was really excited to come up because Montana State's got a great reputation and there's a huge amount of opportunity in Montana. And so I'm going to share with you a lot of what we're seeing across the entire biome. And we're really trying to foster a broader network to take advantage of the expertise that we have in given states, but we're also in low population states. There's a huge amount of demand of our time within that political boundary. And it seems like for some reason we don't cut across those state lines as well as we should. So this is something we're trying to solve. That's one of the things why I agreed to serve in a science advisor role with the NRCS. And so I'll show you some of that narrative, show you some of what we're seeing, and I really hope it leads to some, future collaborations and opportunities as well. Lance was really encouraging me to talk, longer than 1 o'clock. He said it's like free time for students, and I said nobody's hungry, so I'll do my best to do that. But yeah, so he asked me what about for a title, and this is really something that I've been asked to talk on a lot. Is really the status and condition of North America's grassland biome. Where we're at, and there's just a huge movement tied to this on working lands all the way over to conservation groups. And so this is something I've been given a lot, and I really wanted to say, like, we're kind of at that last stand of North America's grassland biome. Like, we're that generation that's going to be it. And so I'll kind of lead you through why. So this is something we published earlier this year, because as we were driving around, and I've done graduate work at Texas A&M, Oklahoma State. I've driven almost all of the Great Plains that's not Mexico or Canada. It feels like on almost every back road and so forth. So I've been fortunate to live the Great Plains pretty much my entire life. And you start recognizing there's a lot of landscapes that just don't look like the Nebraska sandhills. We're driving through that at one point. I'm like, I wonder where it ranks in the world, right? Like to have this kind of contiguous landscape that's still largely intact. And as you go west, maybe more people recognize and feel that kind of vision of horizon and wide open spaces, something that Montana is famous for, right? Like those horizons are going away, and we're losing these kind of intact systems. And so what you're seeing here was an analysis we did that looked at just where are the last continuous grasslands on Earth? Oddly, something that hadn't been done. There'd been stuff done with savannas, but not just grasslands. So this is a map where everywhere that's highlighted in green here is really showing you those large remaining intact areas. Now I live in that one. That's the third most converted grassland region in the world. And we export knowledge from that one into more intact landscapes, and that's happening in grasslands all over. So we're exporting knowledge on smaller scale systems into systems that are huge, broad, and expecting people to be able to plan to deal with those threats. It's very different planning for small scale issues and small scale landscapes than large ones. And that's something that we need to address in a number of like USDA policies, corresponding groups, how we do extension, how we look at our research, right? We're really good at like a lot of small plot work. How realistic is that as it scales up? We need to start connecting those dots, and there's a lot of opportunities for it. I'll show you as we go forward in this, like every continent has one of the last remaining large seven, every vegetated continent, one of the last remaining large intact grasslands in the world. And for here, I wanted to highlight this because we're kind of sandwiched in the primo zone. I mean, if you think of global grassland conservation efforts, there's very few that are relatively large and intact, and we live in them. And yet more people know about tropical rainforest declines. Tropical rainforests have not lost as much as grasslands. Grassland biomes have lost more than any other vegetative biome on the planet. And yet we live in them and know more about other biomes than our losses in our own. So as you track here, like I'm just highlighting some of the last remaining large grassland regions remaining. And talking with like Jeff Beck in Wyoming, it's like, oh yeah, really underappreciated, even though largest stronghold for sage grouse population, some of the large pronghorn migrations left. Sandhills Prairie wasn't even something in Nebraska. They knew that it was even close to being one of the most continuous ones in the world. And when we talk to like National Geographic on this kind of discussion on, hey, look at what we're seeing here with grasslands, like, well, it seems like it's just North America that doesn't know. The Sandhills is actually the only one that doesn't have an internationally based conservation plan to deal with that scale of conservation. So we tend to take them for granted in North America, and we've said this for a long time in rangelands. In fact, there's more grasslands that are almost entirely converted than are remaining intact. And when we look at these, they all start to share similar threats. They all start to share like these broad scale threats playing out this century. And that's something that largely, as I'll show, we're unprepared for. Now, we've got two different grassland types we talk about globally, the shrub steppes, the grassland shrub steppes, and then our true prairies, or kind of temperate grasslands. So here I just wanted to highlight the temperate grasslands. I'm sure you all know a lot about, of course, the shrub steppes like sagebrush ecosystems. And if you look here, I'm going to highlight really there's three big grassland regions left in North America. The shortgrass prairie, right? Montana's part of that. Dakotas and very northwestern Nebraska. The Flint Hills, and then the Sandhills. The Sandhills actually popped out as #1 most intact grassland, true prairie in the world. It won't be by the time I'm done with my career because of what's changing in the Sandhills. And that's my message in Nebraska now that I have tenure. You look at the rest, all the rest, right? Like 5 of the top 10 most converted grasslands in the world are in North America. So we don't do a great job of conserving true prairies at scale. You go west, there's more of our North American shrub steppes that are higher up. Our true prairies, we have some of the least amount remaining. We have 3 in the world left, and those are some of our best opportunities to contribute to global grassland conservation efforts. It's that rare to have that kind of horizon remaining. So this brings me to this point. Now in rangelands, we spent 50 years talking about range condition. So increases and decreases in different type of herbaceous plants. We spent 50 years on that. And then in 1995, the range condition model was rejected because it didn't solve enough of problems that were emerging in those decades. Now I was 15 in 1995. So now I've got a lot more wisdom, as you can tell by all the wisdom on my head that keeps popping up. That's why I tell my kids, like, the gray hair is just wisdom. So this is what the range group was leading to, is we need to start focusing on drivers of alternative states. We need to start focusing on alternative states. So it's not just about the condition of our prairies, but actually these drivers of these kind of collapses of our ecosystem as a whole. And so classically, we're talking about productive coral reefs going to like algal-dominated reefs, things like woody encroachment, a global type of state transition, or, you know, talking about desertification. All these are classic examples of state transitions. What we didn't do well in the range profession is we didn't tie that to space. In fact, all of ecology, in its theory, mostly looked at these over time. So, right, like, well, the scale of this matters. So the scientists studying this today think that the most catastrophic transitions are not just what type of transition you have, but it's the scale of that transition. It's different if it's a 20-acre area, right, or a patch, compared to a landscape, compared to a biome. The scale of those transitions are what's going to affect the kind of ecosystem services that we, and really like how we live in this system. the key message is that we want to avoid these transitions at all costs. If you have large scale transitions, you deal with that long term. There's not a single evidence anywhere, aquatic, terrestrial, where anybody's reversed large scale transitions. It's unprecedented. There's none. So we want to avoid them. And of course, that's really challenging. Now, this is what's in the literature, and I just wanted to highlight this just to highlight how much discussion now is not only on state transitions over the last decade, the discussions on alternative biome states. So meaning the expectation this century is we're going to deal with biome scale collapse. No group of conservation professionals, regardless of any of our departments, have dealt with biome collapse. So when I talk in different rooms, I want you to realize what biome collapse means. If somebody's chair starts to fall apart and break, we could all rally around and fix that chair, right? And we could call in the engineers to help us if we need to. But if this building collapses, we're saying that we're good enough in our profession to stop a building from collapsing after it starts to collapse. That's what we're saying. Which, of course, that's why nobody's done it. So no group of generation, this is what all of you students that are sitting here, this is what we're going to be faced with going forward. Unprecedented scales of collapse that drive our production systems and that threaten our production systems and our wildlife systems and just our ecology and ecosystem services in general. Now, there's 4 major advances that have gotten us out of tracking things through time. So if you think about it like a shallow lake, right, it's got really known boundaries. And if that system flips, we can track that very easily. Terrestrial systems don't have hard boundaries. It's open, and these systems can scale up. So these are things, I won't go over this in detail, but that can help us monitor and track it and actually watch how these transitions play out in space. And this is really important because how we define states is all associated with kind of self-replication, right? Grassland next to grassland, next to grassland, next to grassland. It goes beyond a patch to a landscape to a biome. That self-replication, that's self-organized in nature, determines what we call it in ecology. And so I'm taking you back to like right freshman high school or something when we're talking about biomes and why that's actually fundamentally important. All these states are finite, meaning when one ends, another begins, right? The grasslands hit, say, a boreal forest, right? The boreal forest hits the taiga. So all of them are finite. And when they start to break down, they give off a signal of heightened variation and spatial irregularity over time. So we can use those kind of classes of metrics to track it. So that's my theory stuff. And what I'll mostly, which I don't get to show very often when I talk to most groups. So all of this helps us track it. And we've published on this kind of thing and can show it. So now I'm just going to go right to it. This is, in terms of the US spectrum, the Great Plains biome in 1990. So everywhere that's kind of this sea green on this map looks more like Sandhills Prairie. It's grass dominated. So we're comparing alternative biome states. The red here, that's the woody dominated state. We don't care about that unless they move, right? And so I'll play out how this is moving. So over 30 years. Over 30 years of work on this, and this is just alternative grass woody states. We're tracking the collapse of our biome. So let me break this down a little bit for you. That right there is Halsey National Forest, right? Black Hills of South Dakota. All this starts looking more like those. You can see Montana, right? All this serves as an early warning for large-scale transitions. And I'll show more data, right? We know increases in woody cover are happening in Montana. In fact, there's not a single region in the Great Plains that are not increasing in woody cover. And yet it was said, going back to like clemency and ecology, that it couldn't happen west of like a line in the middle of the Great Plains. It just hadn't happened yet. So all this is novel playing out, right, over 30 years. The Flint Hills burns 2 million acres a year. And they look like the Black Hills, they look like a paleo relic. They're the only group that made the biome flinch. And they're losing. We're working with producers at hundreds of thousands of acres now in the last remaining tallgrass prairie region, because once it surrounds you, they're part of a biome state. And what's happening is it's actually veining into every weakness that they have in their defense system, and they're starting to lose. So we actually are creating different options on how they can win. But from a practical standpoint, this is one of the most expensive things we do in rangelands. We spend hundreds of millions of dollars in NRCS Farm Bill program alone. This is just EQIP. Southern Great Plains, $165 million. There's your warning of what's coming, right? Where do we spend that money? Well, like most things, we react, so we spend it in the red. And what if we spent that money in the green? Would we be better off? We published now multiple things on why this is the case, over the last several years. Basically, like, as we follow this, right, we're just chasing the problem. It's an unsustainable approach. We just wait till there's lots of brush, we remove the brush. And that's on the science. We actually recommended that. So our whole technical guidance, all of our science, just, yeah, we can kill brush, but that doesn't mean we're actually sustaining grasslands and managing the ecosystem. It just reinvades so quickly. Furthermore, and this is hot off the press, this is something we just analyzed because of our connection with the NRCS. They asked us to look at their practice data. So this is 1.14 million NRCS practice applications applied throughout the Great Plains states. Where do we put our practices? So what I want you to see is everywhere red, right? We're putting that behind the biome. Everywhere green, we put it in front of the biome. And this is a rangeland profession. So I call it, we have an improvement then restoration paradigm. So we improve systems that are intact, but they don't have the feedbacks that can keep them intact. And they might even cause us to be more sensitive and vulnerable to collapse. So then we have to put in restoration costs afterwards. That's actually, the next generation has to do that. So what do? Look at all our range improvements are green. So ahead of the biome, windbreak shelter belts, which dominated by eastern red cedar. You then have livestock pipeline, hedgerow plantings, range plantings, right? All these fencing, prescribed grazing, all that's ahead of the biome. What happens after you start to lose rangeland because it's collapsing? Oh, we better solve this building from collapsing. And so we put in our restoration treatments. Until then it gets so bad you're in forest maintenance, forest improvements. This is a legacy of what's playing out over centuries. It doesn't work, right? It's unsustainable long term. So all of this is a reflection of just not having a good spatial game plan that sustains rangelands going forward. We don't want our improvements to hurt the sustainability in future generations. In addition, all of these infrastructure improvements are at risk because they don't help manage woody encroachment. So that's one of my biggest lines now. All that stuff we're doing with water, fencing, grazing infrastructure, it doesn't solve biome collapse. So all of them are at risk, which means we're asking producers to spend money on something that doesn't help them, right, in 10, 20, 30, 40 years. We have to create a more holistic approach that can actually address these broader issues if we're going to sustain this resource long term. If you look at the total practice applications funded, of course, the range profession, our history was centered around grazing management. So what you've seen in the range profession over time is that that's still a critical component. I still look at that data. But that alone, how we move animals around, doesn't solve biome collapse. That's why we have biome collapse, right? It's a symptom that we're missing something in our range paradigm and our range management. And that affects, right, and I'll show it, this affects every other sector, wildlife, beef, pollinators, you name it. So we do more, just to point out, because I'm in the Arbor Day state, we spend more on windbreak shelter belt establishment and have more of those practices than we do on prescribed burning. And temperate grassland biomes were born because of indigenous groups' use of fire. So that's that historical relationship. Now, range management said it was a replaceable tool in the toolbox. We just haven't replaced it. So this is our story. And this is what we're starting to share because we want all these larger landscapes that have a chance to still remain intact, right? And to hopefully do more than just make biome collapse blink. So if I can show this a little bit in a science way, we often describe it this way so I can further reinforce all of this data and what it means. So if we're tracking biome states, we'll often show this through this alternative biome or this alternative cup model. So here's the grass state where we want it in or where we've thrived in before. Here's this regional tree state. And so what we want to do, right, is after we react, we push that ball back over the cup. And what's happening, though, is that over time, all of our management expenditures aren't enough to keep pace with the resilience that's building in the tree-dominated state. So that's what's shown here by the basin of attraction is just getting deeper, even though we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars of restorations on it. And over time, that's just what's playing out. This basin that we don't want, its resilience is increasing. And that's really the problem here. So what do we have to do? We have to spend more and more money over time to keep pace with it. And that's what's playing out. And it's still not working because we're not actually managing for resilience in this model. But even worse is we're ignoring the state we want. We might be the only group tied to agriculture that does that, right? Like we're ignoring the state we do want because we're so busy dealing with this crisis mode after it happens. So what happens in the state we do want? The resilience of that state is eroding over time. because we don't have the feedbacks that enhance its resilience as part of it. And as a result, it takes very little, just exposure to some seed sources of woody plants, right? And boom, you start seeing that collapse happen. We've created highly sensitive, low resilient rangeland production systems. And that works really well as long as we're in this state over here. But what I'm saying is, right, this is all early warning, and we can track it, we can monitor it at various scales and show how this is playing out, and we can do something about it. So that's really the question. How do we actually do this? How do we enhance resilience and scale this up? So that'll be primarily most of my ties of like some of the stuff tied to theory. And I'll start showing you like what I show different producer groups, industry, conservation groups as well. When we have biome collapse, we know in the science we have biome level consequences. That's now what we're also able to track. So I'm showing you like there's 80 years of research tied to woody encroachment in the Great Plains. Here's my hit list, and it's something for everybody. So if you care about this was the endangered American burying beetle, right? Preventing endangered species that require grasslands. Like you care about this transition. Pollinators collapse that are required for like grassland breeding habitat. Grassland plant diversity collapses as you get this biome transition. We're actually tracking where we've seen reductions in pronghorn recruitment with Jeff Beck's data in Wyoming as a result of even like 1% increase in juniper cover in some of their best areas. It affects large-scale migrations and shuts those off. We only have one prairie chicken species that hasn't been listed on the Endangered Species Act, and its stronghold is at the edge of biome collapse in Nebraska sandhills. So there's actually stuff from Oklahoma State. Tick-based vectors increased in cedar-dominated woodlands compared to grasslands and deciduous forests. West Nile virus is higher in cedar-dominated woodlands than they are in grasslands. Wildfire danger increases to the one region that doesn't have it, and we're tracking that in the Great Plains. And now we have wildfires that have killed people in Nebraska this year. It affects water and hydrology. It affects school funding. It affects every citizen in our states, and we haven't told that story. And what are ranchers doing? Ranchers, of course, are this part, and that's at least what we gave them credit for. In reality, what we're asking ranchers to do is manage our ecosystem services in private land states. It's not just production system. We're asking them to do this, and we're taking it for granted. As biomes collapse, we will have natural disasters, effects to social programs, collapses in biodiversity tied to grasslands and rangelands, right? All the things that has already been case studied in the science already. All this stuff here is already published. So we already know this is going to keep playing out. And these are the things we don't want, right? We don't thrive in that space of collapse. We thrive in these stable systems. We've actually published work showing that as this space changes in Kansas, what's basically happening is they have less and less safe operating space. Their usable habitat space is declining. So their lek space actually starts to retreat before the biome and before these signals hit them. So this is like seeing in the eyes of a chicken. People have looked at this in northeastern Nebraska, and you can actually see where leks are blinking out as this collapse is playing out. So we can actually show you scales relevant to it. What do we want to do? If you care about chickens, keep the green green, right? Could it be simpler? We want to keep this open at large scales because they benefit from it. It's not just them, though. We're actually tying it to a multivariate signal of avian biomes. So what I showed you before was just due to plants. We see with breeding bird data, this is by Caleb Roberts, who's now at University of Arkansas and was a postdoc in my lab. As this collapse is happening, we actually see the grassland regimes relative to forest regimes, those boundaries are breaking down. And we're starting to see that boundaries start to mingle. And what that's a second indicator in ecology of multiple regimes at biome scales actually starting to collapse and play out. So if you play this out in Texas, what's happening is that our grassland birds are declining and our forested birds are increasing. But by the time a wildlife person can give you this data, what are you going to do at large scales? Right? Like they're declining. How are you going to get that back when you're talking about large scale collapse? So what we're showing you here is like the warning of that collapse is already happening. We should be keeping the green green, keep these larger habitats open because they benefit our grassland bird communities at large scales. And that's where we have more success with our individual species conservation efforts. Now, maybe it's not those kind of things that float your boat. Maybe it's things like water. So the Nebraska sandhills has the Ogallala Aquifer. It drives our irrigation, our corn production. Lincoln and Nebraska get drinking water that comes from the Platte out of the sandhills from it. This is just published now as of, it maybe came online yesterday. And so this is a really important watershed in the sandhills. Now the sandhills, right? #1 most intact temperate grassland in the world. Now you have cedar coming up into it. And as eastern red cedar encroachment occurs over time, this is due to this is due to scenario planning of like different scenarios in the future of different encroachment levels. Look at what starts happening to percent discharge of the middle loop. Well, the middle loop hits the Platte. And basically what's happening is the Platte River no longer gets that cleaner water that helps dilute it. And so what the conclusion was of the hydrologist is that as eastern red cedar encroachment increases, stream flow decreases, evapotranspiration increases, and nitrate will increase, which of course is a huge issue tied to water quality. So water quality and quantity are going to be negatively impacted due to a tree that we've planted since almost 1920s and have widely promoted, but never knew, right, that it would expand and have this impact. But now we know, and it has consequences that go way beyond what anyone would expect. And so we'll have influences with water that compound issues like this year with drought as we go forward. And we'll wish we had that water back because this is a highly appropriated system. But then there's the production aspect, and this was kind of the general data that we had, and every long-term experiment shows the same thing, a 75% loss of livestock production potential. Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, all the same long-term data. So this is from Texas, and just shows you like that kind of impact. Now, what's all this variability? Anybody know? That's just precip. So drought will not matter after you lose your 75% of your forage base and herbaceous production. Our worst droughts that we've had in Nebraska, like on local site data, like 50% reduction in herbaceous production for 1 year tied to the 2012 drought, right? Drought by definition is not permanent. This is 75% reduction and it's permanent. Yet we have all these risk mitigation programs tied to drought, and we're ignoring woody encroachment, even though it has all those consequences, impacts that people from the Southern Great Plains have been sharing for decades, going, maybe the Central and Northern Great Plains should pay attention, right? Of like what's playing out tied to this, because you don't want these issues. So, and this is kind of where we're at. So then this got published last week and was led by part of a national science team. Look at this, Scott Morford at the University of Montana led this project. And basically we were able to quantify, I mean, we had all these things, all these ecosystem services, but most of the literature was focused more on biodiversity, water, soils, those kind of impacts. The range profession, we didn't have as good of data on herbaceous production, even though that was our strongest tie to private working lands. So that was one of the things we set out to fix. So we now know how much every region produces in terms of rangelands. It's not that marginal. So think about it, like how much corn production state of Nebraska is every year. It's incredible amount of production. And they say it as a statewide production count in ag statistics. And then they'd ask me how much is grown in range. And I'd be like, 400 kilograms per hectare, 4,000 kilograms per hectare, whatever, right? Like your kilograms per hectare, grams per meter squared. That was how we told them the plot. The rest of ag was telling them about how much the state grew. We now have that same kind of data. And we can also tell them how much is being lost due to things like woody encroachment. So I'm going to focus on the Great Plains, but we have this data nationally. And what I want you to look at is that there's only 3 that show a decline. Everything else is increasing in terms of tree cover. These 3 are forested and California systems, and they're very small amounts of total acres overall. It is increasing everywhere. Every single region has increases in trees. So we see woody expansion everywhere. That's important because, right, like as I go into areas more intact, the first thing I have to deal with is denial. And then we deal with like, well, I have it under control. And then we deal with, oh wait, like my neighbors and I are trying to figure out how to solve this problem. That's what plays out universally everywhere. So we're trying to break this down because there's greater opportunities as we go north into the system. So here's how I show this information in Oklahoma to South Dakota right now, and that's been really effective. So South Dakota, their state con also jumped on this kind of NRCS initiative because they knew the conversation was that you're next. We think you're the leading edge. Well, unfortunately, in 2019, South Dakota lost 145,000 tons to woody encroachment. That's how much every year a little bit more gets lost to woody encroachment. So by not keeping it constant since 1990, every year we lose a little bit more. And every year this number will be higher because it's just eating into our ag production and range, our habitat and so forth. Well, Nebraska used to look like South Dakota, right? Think of that biome collapse signal I talked about. So Nebraska now has lost 420,000 tons. And Kansas used to look like Nebraska, and they've lost 2 million tons. And Oklahoma used to look like Kansas, and they're now up to 4.5 million tons. And I show this information in Oklahoma, and I immediately have requests to talk to their state government representatives and their legislative representatives, because that's production that we could have used. Now, if this was corn in Nebraska, we'd be acting yesterday, right? Like 420,000 tons of corn production lost to a pest, that would be a huge crisis in the state. As a result of this data, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association now has a national policy that is in their, that actually talks about being very aggressive on supporting programs addressing woody encroachment at national scales. So they went ahead and jumped past even the state effort, saying this is such a big threat to production after they saw this, it was one top. Now, I don't know what 420,000 or 4.5 million tons is. It's really hard to imagine. So Shelley Kelly of Sandhills Task Force goes like, can we create an equivalent metric? So it's like, okay, round bales. Well, what came out with Nebraska is 420,000 tons equivalent to almost 700,000 round bales. I still can't picture what that is. So I could leave Lincoln, Nebraska, third most converted grassland in the world, and drive into North Platte and enter the Sandhills, most intact temperate grassland, all the way up to Valentine and see nothing but round bales for 10 hours. Now, if you've ever driven I-80, some people say it's boring. This would officially be the most boring drive you've ever taken in the world. Nothing but round bales for 10 hours. Like, that's what we lost in 2019. What'll happen next year? Like, what will it be? Almost 11 hours, right? And this is the legacy of what's coming. Now, I want you to look at this map, all right? And look at the Great Plains and just watch this play out over time. Because we're now talking about like the loss to the ag industry alone is billions in terms of the accumulated loss since 1990. So that's what that one looks like. Well, we came up with this idea because in agronomy and horticulture, they do all these global yield gap analyses in Nebraska. So this is what we like to see. That would be no yield gap, right? Production is meeting that 1990 baseline. So what we're tracking over time is, and monitoring and being able to model, is over time we're seeing a gap compared to that baseline. We want to avoid yield gaps in agriculture. Rangeland said the opposite. It's okay if you lose yield. It's okay if those woody plants come in. You have to wait until 10% cover and then we'll treat it, and it's more expensive and you've lost yield. So for some reason, rangeland guidance is the opposite of the rest of agriculture guidance. We want to avoid losses in yield. We want to avoid losses in wildlife habitat. Our extension coming from the research, trickling all the way through the system, is reinforced a culture where this is being lost because we are actually promoted waiting. So we want to start getting ahead of it. And I was told affecting the Farm Bill would be impossible. We're seeing this change at national levels, and every group is talking about preventing this now as a result of these conversations. It's tied to federal land management, NGOs, and so forth. Well, these losses follow signals of early warning. So I'm going to zoom in on that early warning signal. So this is one county. So this was Knox County, 29,000 tons, one of our most impacted counties by woody expansion since that timeline. Interesting side note, when I came to Nebraska, it was 2013. I was flat out told there is no cedar problem in the state of Nebraska. That was what I was told. I was like, well, that sounds like an interesting hypothesis. I think I'll test that, which might not have been the smartest thing because I didn't have tenure yet. But it's like, why would we assume right off the bat? It was like that those problems of the Southern Great Plains you're used to, those aren't here. Well, we should have been starting in the 90s. We should have been starting in South Dakota with the data I have in the 90s. Everywhere we're always so far behind, it's so hard to catch up. So what's happening? This is Knox County 1990, the zoomed in. All the green areas are that kind of historically grassland dominated network. All the whites, the massed out from like mostly ag, other land conversions. That's 2020. Now notice it has spatial order. It is not random, right? This has spatial order, and I can actually track this out over time and watch this kind of spread like the plague, which means it's not unpredictable. It's not random. It can be managed if it has spatial order. And we've kind of treated this problem as if it is random. We didn't have a spatial game plan. We now do. So instead of just working in the red, which is where we spend all of our money here, they now have a regional scale conservation plan tied to core areas, defending those core areas and working out from there. It's really incredible to see that play out now. But I can take that data and compare it to Cherry County. Cherry County goes 3 million tons of range production every year. Really a politically iconic county, but I'm starting to see signals of a yield gap, right? And those signals follow losses associated with early warning. So that's 1990, that's 2020. They start looking like 2000 Knox County. So now I can go to producers in Cherry County and say, you've seen the story of Knox County. I'm sorry we said it wouldn't happen here, but it is happening here. And you can see all these signals of early warning are more upland sites that are starting to turn yellow. Those are where it starts to expand next. So that's now the current discussion up there in Knox County. In fact, I have to go all the way to Arthur County in the edge of the sandhills before I don't see a yield gap. And remember, I was told 9 years ago it wasn't a problem. But does it follow signals of early warning? And the answer is yes. Now, if you go to this area, it looks amazing. But now with what I see, all I see is risk starting to pop up in the landscape and knowing that we've struggled to manage this risk. So my summary of all the data across all counties at the scale of a county, notice the color spectrum and notice the biome collapse I showed you earlier. There is no county that's restored lost yield after wood encroachment starts to take over grasslands. Not a single one. So maybe a county in Montana thinks they can be the first, but nobody's been able to do it. Even worse, no county's ever prevented this from happening. So as a rangeland ecologist, I can pretty much guarantee two things. We will have drought, and you will lose production to woody encroachment going forward. So that's what this data is telling us. And I like to show this in lots of other weird ways. Like in 2000, only 2 counties were showing a yield gap. 10 years after that, 8 counties. 10 years after that, 19 counties. So we have 6 counties that aren't showing yield gaps. But where are we going to be in 10 years? So the focus is like, can we start to put a bullseye on those 6 counties, or are we going to continue to chase the problem? And we're chasing the problem, but people are trying. So we're just not getting far enough ahead of it, which is why we're having this discussion. Montana is no different. We have the data for Montana. We have the data for every county going backwards. So what do we see? We see yield gaps, right? And this is where beef is sourced on rangelands, right? These are our wildlife habitats that are highly sensitive to tree encroachment. And this is what's playing out. So just big picture, the message is we can talk about those issues, but we haven't stopped this kind of scale of an issue. And the earlier we act, that's where we're starting to see better successes play out long term. But we're talking about biome collapse, right? It is not just 40 years ago a local resource concern anymore. It's not something you can technically really do by yourself. And so we've worked with multiple groups to help provide data that goes into things like the Central Grassland Roadmap. And you can see the remaining cores that have either escaped the tractor or escaped the trees. So 16% of the biomes escaped those 2 drivers. Those are your biome scale threats. Everything else is more regional threat. Woody encroachment, land use conversion are the top 2 drivers of biome threats associated with vegetation change and alternative biome states. This is the network. Everywhere green is what's escaped it. Everywhere yellow is what's at risk, meaning it's either higher cultivation levels or in our data showing woody encroachment happening starting now. So that's all the yellow. The purple is all the highly impacted stuff already. So all these are starting to have big bullseyes on them. And you're going to see people start to talk about, hey, we need to defend these areas of Montana, Wyoming, New Mexico, Nebraska, et cetera. And we've applied the same mentality to cheatgrass invasions. Because how do you solve cheatgrass? Well, you don't solve it by chasing it. Solve it by identifying areas that are free of cheatgrass, and it's spatially expanding into those, just like woody encroachment is. We had similar types of data. So this is what's being talked about in areas where the cheatgrass is the biome threat. Now, that's not the biome threat here. We have other weeds, more regional concern. And if you have those, good, because they're not as bad as these. If you have a grazing problem, great, because you don't want these, right? Like that's a local resource concern. We want to have grazing problems again, traditional range management. You don't want biome threats. You don't want cheatgrass, right? Like that's that narrative. So the earlier we get on it, the better. So we came up with this infographic that got applied that we were really good ambulance drivers and we just drive our ambulances all over. And what we're asking for the first time is to do preventative care on our rangelands, keep them higher levels of resilience, keep them more intact, and prevent them against these alternative biome state drivers. And again, that's impossible. Now, I love to deal with impossible questions. That's what I think is my job. So when I'm thinking of like, what's the hardest thing I can do at this stage? Collapsing biome. Can we show levels of success in a collapsing biome? And that was the other part that the NRCS asked me to do. They said, Dirac, we're getting a D+ from Congress on our outcomes in rangeland tied to this kind of stuff. Like we're spending tons of money right on brush management and other things, but we're not getting the outcomes we want. So how do we actually address it? And what we're talking about is like, this is a framework and a guide that came out. Over 20,000 copies of this were distributed, printed at request, and sent all over the Great Plains. This is being adopted really by every federal land management agency tied to work that's happening in the Great Plains right now. And it's meant to apply this vulnerability framework that's really simple. There's two things playing out in our grasslands tied to woody encroachment. We've made them more sensitive to recruitment and spread of woody plants. But the one we ignored in the science was exposure, right? Oh, I can change how I graze. I can put in fire. I can do things to manage the sensitivity of my system. But we said, you don't have to worry about seed sources. And it hit us in the lab of, oh my gosh, it's invasion 101. It's spreading through seed source. So what happens if you do mechanical removal? The seed is there. We're just not different than any other species. We're viewing our system through our eyes. We're clearing brush, but we're ignoring the seed in the seed bank or the seedlings hidden in the grass. So what happens? Oh, so you have to ask that producer or conservation professional to do it again. And over time, we've actually now published it speeds up. That's why Texas tells the not so funny joke, they sell the ranch 3 times to pay for brush management. So that's what's coming. So what do we want to do? Exposure, we found out, is more important than sensitivity. That's why the Flint Hills is losing. They've got an increased exposure to seed sources and threat. And they used to be intact and didn't have it. So that's really what I'm talking about here is both those have gone up, our risk has gone up. We need to change that in our intact systems and reduce the risk. Removal of woody encroachment by itself does not do that. That's our important message. It doesn't manage risk. All it does is remove big plants. That's it. Second, what we see in the data is exposure is more important to sensitivity. Now, people have applied this already on large landscapes, talking about hundreds of thousands of acres on some private lands work. Even like U.S. Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, others are starting to apply this and manage risk. It's estimated that we're saving conservation groups $25 to $500 per acre compared to the traditional brush management model, which means they can treat more. Halsey National Forest, where we started tree planting and stuff, they are applying this to conserve their grasslands to save themselves from themselves because they have a big seed source. And so think of it like a donut. Well, they've got that grassland they're responsible for. It's incredible. They got the cost looking for the leading edge of encroachment, and to get that before it creates new seed sources, $1 to $2 per acre contracted out. To bring out the big Tonka toys to remove this stuff, it's hundreds of dollars per acre. And in Texas, Oklahoma, there's some bids in some areas that are up to $2,000. So think, we're asking people to wait, and then they're also losing their income base. It's just not sustainable at these scales. And we didn't have the guidance. We missed it in our profession. But now that we know this is working more effectively already in these kind of pilot programs. So I really like this graphic. I was flying over the edge of biome collapse in the sandhills. So this is actually a picture I took where this was the leading edge of cedar coming out. And so if you think about it, what we're saying is here's where you have the transition. And then here you have encroachment. But all this is not intact grassland. This is contaminated grassland. So 95% of recruitment of eastern red cedar seedlings happens within 2 football fields of a seed source. We published that 2 months ago. We can manage 2 football fields. So if you think about that as what you have to manage, right? All of a sudden, what's the goal? No 5-foot tall cedar tree ever goes into intact grassland ever again. And that's true if it's mesquite, huisach in Texas, honey locust, you name it, whatever it happens to be. Stop allowing mature individuals from putting seed into your intact rangeland where you don't want it. And all of a sudden, every person can visualize that. But what we did is we spent our money here. What happens if you cleared all that? It all comes back and the yellow becomes red and the green becomes yellow. So that's what we spent all of the farm bill expenditures doing. And that's why biomes collapse and it's not working. We want to anchor to intact grasslands and work the other direction. And that's what groups are starting to do. So I want to show you this is kind of cool because it's become part of a bigger narrative. So because we're starting to show better outcomes and success, and I'll give you a quick rundown of that. This narrative has been adopted for the first ever biome framework from the USDA NRCS. So we had all sorts of conservation frameworks, but we never had a large scale conservation plan, right? We were basically managing pastures or lower. Now we have a biome framework for conservation action, and it addresses the top 2 biome threats. We have a grassland roadmap, which is tied to the major NGOs. If you haven't heard about this, this is an international collaboration that's bringing together NGO groups, federal land management groups, tribal lands, working lands groups, everybody to try and increase funding because of the 3 billion bird problem. And that grasslands are losing more than any other group. So this is their approach. Well, they incorporated our data, and this is NRCS's contribution to the roadmap. And you have the startup of state-based initiatives to actually start to secure more intact grasslands instead of waiting before they collapse to help them. So some of the best areas in Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma said we were too good to help because we didn't have enough woody cover. Now they have a bullseye on them to say, wait, you're the last grasslands. For the first time, we're reinforcing a culture of range. I think that's been one of the biggest weaknesses of our profession. We were reinforcing a symptom of a bigger problem before. We were spending our money after problems started to occur. But where the culture wanted to keep it most intact, they were too good to get help on these larger scale issues. That's now changing. So this is what that Great Plains Grassland Initiative looks like in the central region. Each of these states are doing it independently, but notice how it starts matching up. So South Dakota is identifying where there's cultural will as part of a proposed phase 1 implementation program. Nebraska launched theirs last year. So you have the Sandhills Southwest, and then you have this area northeast that I showed you, that even though it's been hugely impacted, they're starting to defend these smaller cores and conserve those. The 3 major grassland historical regions of Kansas and the last 5 grassland areas of Oklahoma. And if I showed you the data, they don't look that good as they do on this map. So we're prioritizing our last regional grasslands in these areas. And the focus is addressing drivers of large scale loss, meaning those biome threats. All right, so I wanted to show you how this looks in practice. This is the Les Canyons experimental landscape. This is what started driving some of the attention because we were actually starting to implement. We were basically working with them on large scales, trying to figure out how to solve woody encroachment at a bigger scale. So this is Scott Stout, and I showed up for the first time here, and they, instead of bringing them into a setting like this, I went to them. And so we met at a cattleman's, kind of steakhouse that's in a town of 100 people. And what we did was talk about basically how do we address this issue that's on their areas and what's happening throughout the Great Plains. And it's kind of an uncomfortable setting when you're a new professor, right? You're going to their comfort zone. And over time, I've gotten more and more comfortable with that because it's the smartest thing I ever did. So I'm doing experiments on a network of lands. This is a 300,000 acre priority conservation landscape. It's a biologically unique landscape tied to our state wildlife action plan. And of course, it's all tied to working lands for beef production. See all this area here? We did that for them when they gave us their membership, because in response to woody encroachment, what groups do is they turn to fire. So that 4-letter word for the Sandhills when I got there, for Montana, when you lose to woody encroachment of conifers, people will turn to fire. We published that going back to 2013. Every place that didn't want fire will turn to it because it's the last economical option. So if you don't want it here, keep areas intact because people will turn to it because they get desperate. But this group is one of the best in the world. They restored a fire culture. This is 200,000+ acres of what they own that they've rebuilt to create a fire culture in response to this issue. So I want to just give you what we've now measured as groups scale up and we started to learn these things and really why it's so important to defend these kind of core areas. So they're the first region we have in the data so far to halt regional scale transitions. So we don't have county level stuff yet, but we're close. We don't have a biome that's stable, but we do see a 300,000 acre region that they stabilize through their work. That's what success looks like right now. And it looks like complete war zone. So this is what it looked like in 2000. Cedar dominated state, grassland dominated state, 2005, 2010, 15, 16, 17, 18. When I show this to producer groups all throughout the Great Plains that have been fighting this, they're like, finally somebody's winning the war on woody encroachment. This is where they burn across properties helping each other because this is a fire sensitive plant, right, with eastern red cedar to keep that at bay. And if you ask Scott Stout or any of them, they'd say start now because this is how hard it is. And notice they didn't go to the red. They worked on the boundary. That's where we started to go, oh, they basically halted this. So all the producers here can thank all these producers for preventing woody plants from getting to them so far. In addition, we've actually seen regional scale increases in bird richness. So not only is it benefiting the production of that area, it's benefiting the entire grassland bird community, even where they're not birding. The regional richness is increased. As far as we know, this is the first example of this in the world where we've been able to track restoration and increases in bird richness after losing to an alternative vegetative state. The American burying beetle is actually increasing. Now this is like holy grail, right? We're increasing what was an endangered species. And a lot of people still think it should be endangered. That population is increasing in this landscape. And it's tied to, what do they like? They like intact grasslands. They rapidly decline as grasslands collapse. They don't like low levels of tree cover at large scales, and they don't like crop cover. As crop cover, they decline, right? More grass cover, that's where you see beetles. So they just like intact grasslands in this landscape. They don't like these two alternative states. We see increases in grassland plant diversity and grassland plant richness. Remember how I said the warning of biome consequences? All those indicators that are declining, we're actually now measuring the opposite. We get increase in production, increases in bird richness, increases in plant richness. We have lower reduction in wildfire risk. So I have a lot of background in fire. So we were actually able to model that what happens is that as they're doing this and taking systems like this back to grassland, this becomes more suppressible to firefighters, and you just have lower fire danger than compared to these volatile juniper fuels. We actually have increased production. So USDA AFRI wants to have, what was something like a 20% increase in production. So as part of a USDA AFRI, like $20 million grant. Well, we've increased it almost 3,000% because nothing grows underneath juniper trees. So, right, like we see this play out over time. And we can now model why this is truly beneficial for this group. So over time, what I'm showing you is the amount of trees in like 100,000 acre area that we were able to work with them on relative to herbaceous production and that yield gap signal. So that is when they formed their burn association. This is when we started working with them on this experimental landscape. That is when trees started to go the other direction. And they were just applying things that we were talking about that we thought might be working more without even a formal experimental process doing it. And notice their yields going back up. That's hugely beneficial. We've got actually other regions now that are showing the same signals in Kansas, right? So no group has done this at these scales. It's that novel. So we can do things about this, but we're working to defend these areas that are more productive and intact and so forth. For them, that area is $250,000 more profitable every year than it was just 5 years ago. Not so marginal, right, to those producers. So we've got this in National Geographic, production deals. There are stories kind of all over. Audubon magazine. This is what we can start to tell the story on more as we start to actually win the battle against these broader issues. So we're seeing a lot of success with this. And obviously, like, this can be done easier if you do it sooner. And that's part of our other message. I really like this slide, and I've got just one other one after this, but this was something that an NRCS person put together when talking to Nebraska. They said, we were formed as an agency because of this, right? One of the big, large-scale transitions that took place. It just happened to happen all at once. This is what's playing out over decades. These require bold actions and plans going forward if we're going to address installment. And we're already showing evidence where we can start to do that on working lands, and it's making sense to producers with just this kind of messaging and mentality. And it's obviously benefiting much more than that. When I think of that, all I see is a network of potential areas throughout the Great Plains that have the potential to keep these areas intact by operating sooner. And this is just, right, like me just picking out some examples. And I've given this as an example of what should we be doing? Well, we should be establishing, cloning that example, a series of these regional scale demonstration sites that document how to win. So ecologists, we're great at talking about how the sky is falling, the biome's collapsing, right? Really good at that. Agriculture engineers, so great at talking about how to solve problems. So we're finally kind of blending that together a little bit, right? But it doesn't work if we don't show them success. We can't build programs around failure. That was what I was told. You're doing a great job showing we're failing in a biome, but I can't build a new program around failure. We have to show them how to actually win against these broader issues. Wood encroachment, cheatgrass, you name it, that's affecting these last iconic areas. As we do that, we need to improve kind of our science delivery and technical guidance, and really continue to measure that and to share these stories across the biome instead of just one local place. And it doesn't really matter what scale we're at. Even the Texas coastal prairie has a network of little core areas that are left because of past investments. It's just starting at the scale that we're at and starting to build out and reduce the pressure on them. We should be increasing multi-state communications of the common threats instead of only focusing on our local stuff, because we're missing some of the big picture in rangelands. And finally, and we're starting to see this, modernize this policy guidance and align the policy guidance from local levels up to international ones. We're all trained to be so reductionist in the Great Plains and know our local issues, but we're missing some of the things that are commonly affecting everybody, and that can generate support at national, international levels. We're starting to see that kind of take off and have common momentum on it. So these are things I've been starting to share, and I wanted to share that here because we're in one of the primo areas, right? And there's opportunities there. And I just want to see some rangelands win. If I go through my career and there's somebody that has a county, that's a win because we don't have many of those left. And that's what's going to be coming to this area too. And I think everybody can sense it. So this is what there's opportunity for future generations to do. And we're already seeing the hope there. But that's not my, I guess, big call to action. So keep an eye on this kind of stuff. And find ways where you might be able to provide leadership as we go forward in this into the future. So with that, thanks so much for having me. Really look forward to interacting with people more. Yeah, and just can't wait to talk with you guys in the future beyond just my short visit today.
A question. So in the defend the core, expand the core philosophy that you guys have been promoting in your workflow, a key component is to lower the sensitivity of transitions for states. How do you recommend doing that in Northern Great Plains?
So it's interesting because it becomes a more practical discussion. And I was trained by really good extension people as well. So I could go guns blazing to western third of Nebraska and be like, look, we should reduce exposure to the biggest threat, and that's eastern red cedar. So we should stop planting it, right? Like, and I would immediately get ran out because they have identity to that as much as anything else. They have pride in those shelter belts for sure. And it goes back for decades and generations. In reality, if you look at this, there's nobody that's proven that you can prevent that threat from expanding. But if we reduce the risk instead of waiting, it's possible. So if we started to be smarter about where we put in our windbreaks to where they're easier to manage, and 2 football fields becomes a high maintenance grassland, they've got a shot. So that's kind of my message in those areas. Well, as we go to another area of Nebraska, they've only got 1,500 acres to 3,500 acres left, and there's like ghost greater prairie chicken populations remaining. They're kind of just lingering, hanging on. Well, we start there. Now, they don't have the same issues as Western Nebraska, so it's more of anchor to your intact areas and then manage that exposure to the threat and keep those intact. And we start, it's no longer a silver bullet. It actually becomes a really practical thing that anybody could figure out how to do. So we actually walk through our process in a way that is more customizable. But the planning is be smarter about the exposure. What can we do to reduce the sensitivity to your system? And every landowner then comes up with their innovative approach of how they want to do it instead of me telling, which of course is a smart move, I think in terms of extension. So at Lindley, every place is different. Kansas, right? They don't like trees as much and they like fire more. So they start talking fire immediately. Nebraska is more like really timid about fire in certain areas, and others are wanting to do it yesterday. So you're more playing to the culture of how they might want to attack it. But if you lose area to mature seed stores, we have very low confidence that you're going to be able to maintain that if you wait to act. Now, the same thing I think is true with cheatgrass. Exposure to cheatgrass is kind of what we missed in our guidance there in rangelands too, right? So I start thinking about how does cheatgrass gets transported. So dispersal for cedar, 2 football fields from a seed source. That's the primary dispersal mechanism. And what causes a seed source to be in places? Humans, more than anything else. We plant. Cheatgrass. Well, we transport cattle, right? There's lots of things we do in terms of moving cattle from an area that might have cheatgrass into an intact one. You start thinking about like where's the pathways that cause us to be exposed to a threat. We should think about managing that to biome issues. Once it's there, what are the potential for cheatgrass to spread? How can we reduce sensitivity? And how can we minimize our exposure? So all these things, it's, I think, similar mentality. And to be honest, the proof comes through these kind of experiments and collaborations. Like we don't know how to do it in cheatgrass because we're just now thinking this way. And might not even be possible to some extent. Same with woody encroachment. What scale of success can we have? But I'm always hesitant to provide the silver bullet recipe book. I want to do that with producers because they're really good at it.
Well, sorry, we're out of time. I know you're giving away, we have 5 minutes of free Dirac. I mean, no charge.
Yeah, right. No,
Thanks again for coming.
thanks.
No grad students, lunch with Dirac down the hall.